We tried to do this in June, and we got sort of, we were derailed, but here we are. We persevered. Just like OconeeBell seems to hang in there, seems to persevere. Really great to see you and see familiar faces, old friends in the audience, and also folks that I don't know. But I think all of us sort of kindred botanical spirits, it's fair to say. All of you may be intrigued by this interesting plant that was selected to be the kind of botanical mascot of this chapter. Some years ago, I'm not trained as a botanist, but I am kind of a plant nerd. I do love my native plants, and of course you can't help but develop an appreciation for Oconee-bells, living and working in Highlands. And some years ago, I started a program in March when actually this species blooms, right? A fairly narrow window when it blooms down in Devil's Fork State Park, and started to kind of do a sort of annual pilgrimage, presentation followed by a field trip, and that's kind of it's become sort of a nice tradition. I think that's how I had the pleasure of meeting Trevor and Nancy, and this is a story that I find deeply fascinating because it connects my interest in botany, botanical history, interesting plants, and history of science. And of course, natural history in there. So it's really such a pleasure and a privilege for me to be invited. And thank you again to Gorgeous, because it's especially nice to be in this fabulous state park and be able to present the story of this really neat plant. So my title here is Andre Michaux, Asa Gray, and the Lost and Found Shortia. And you notice that here I have Asa Gray, and here I have, oh, wait a minute, is that a contemporary photograph of Andre Michaux? Chances are, if you Google, Andre Michaux, and kind of like I did with all Asa Gray, and you try to get a photograph, you're going to come up with a photograph, a portrait that looks like this. And actually, this is widely presented as none other than Andre Michaux, erroneously. This is not Andre Michaux, this is his son, Francois. But you'll find, and I made this mistake myself, I'm guilty, right? This is repeated in the literature. This is Andre. Actually, apparently there's no known portrait, no extant portrait of Andre Michaux, which is remarkable because he was a noted botanist in his day. He was, after all, a royal botanist for the colonies here. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Maybe one will turn up at some point. But I present here instead Charlie Williams, our friend Charlie, who contacted me. He wished he could have been here tonight. Charlie is a Michaux scholar, and he does sort of a one-man playing on the story of Andre Michaux's explorations and discoveries. So here he is in his Andre Michaux garb, right? He also has really performed a tremendous service with colleagues to the history of science by publishing a few years ago, University of Alabama Press. Some of you have this, I know, this hefty volume, the first really full English translation of Andre Michaux's travels, his journals, and with annotations and extensive historical notations and maps. And this is really a labor of love. This is a fabulous and very interesting book. Any of you who may be plant geeks and may be interested in history of science, I really can't recommend this volume enough. It's very, very interesting. So I've kind of known Charlie for quite a long time, and of course, being based at the Highlands Biological Station, I've known Oconee-bells for a long time. Oconee-bells really is found in untold thousands growing on the campus of the Highlands Biological Station, which would seem odd because, as Nancy mentioned, it doesn't naturally occur on the Highlands Plateau. What's it doing there? Why so much of it, The biological station grounds, about 23 acres or so. Most of that is natural area. Much of that is what we call native plant botanical garden, really natural areas where we can celebrate native plants in a pretty natural setting, natural biological communities, along with a range, a kind of garden of gardens, a range of kind of specialty gardens that kind of demonstrate native plants in lots of different contexts. We sort of celebrate these plants and support the botanical gardens in lots of ways, including we celebrate them with our native plant symposium. Every other year we hold this native plant celebration, and one is coming up in mid-September, so please do join us. I have flyers out in the back of the room. And if you're intrigued by my commenting on Charlie Williams as Andre Michaux, I'm pleased to say that on Friday night we have Andre Michaux live and in person. Charlie himself will be here at the biological station. So he'll be channeling Andre Michaux. So come and join us for that. That event is actually just open to the public. And then the main part of the symposium with the various talks and live and silent plant auctions and all kinds of other stuff, that goes on in the Highlands Community Building the next day on Saturday. So I have some flyers back there, and this is also up on our website. So, help us celebrate, OconeeBells and friends at the Highlands Botanical Garden. And again, to sort of return to this question, those of you that are familiar with the biological station, this logo will not be new to you, this kind of three-panel logo. And but you may have wondered, some may have wondered, well, why exactly, this logo that sort of represents its spirit, the salamander, kind of the Highlands Nature Center, that's part of the station, the central panel of the research and education labs, and then this panel over here on the left, which you will recognize as a stylized OconeeBells. And again, this plant, this interesting plant, was adopted as our botanical mascot also. But again, why? It doesn't naturally occur there. Why are we adopting a non-native, well, not really non-native, it doesn't normally grow at that elevation. So there's sort of a story there. There's kind of an interesting tale about this iconic wildflower that I want to share with you, okay? And the tale, you can start it in any number of places. I want to start it with none other than Asa Gray, because Gray, the foremost American botanist of his day in the 19th century, he was kind of a founding professor of natural history and botany at Harvard, good friend of Charles Darwin's, really important figure. You get a sense from this U.S. postage stamp how important OconeeBells was to him, because this plant was selected to illustrate, right, on the stamp honoring Asa Gray. What's going on there? Well, I'd like to sort of paraphrase the botanist M.V.O. Gorman, that there's kind of a slightly complicated, fascinating story here about this curious plant. This is a plant that, it can be said, was found by a guy that never named it, never gave it a name. And it was named, ultimately, for another person who never saw it, right? Never even tried to see it. And it was named by a guy who looked and looked and looked and could never find it. So, this, in a nutshell, this really encapsulates the fascinating story of this interesting plant, right? So, found by a man who never named it. Well, let's just start right there, right? It starts with Andre Michaux. Right? Andre Michaux did not, bestow the scientific or Latin name on this plant. Michaux is an interesting figure. Died tragically a bit young in the early 1800s, but he had sort of humble origins, the son of a farm manager. He then, had a sort of a change in life in the early 1770s after the death of his wife. He threw himself into the study of botany and horticulture. In Paris, he studied with Bernard de Jussot of the famous Michaux family. Much of our current understanding of sort of botanical nomenclature kind of comes not necessarily from Linnaeus, more from the Michaux. So this is a very important group or family in Paris studying plants. Youngish Michaux botanized in England. He actually served as an assistant working with the great naturalist Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. Right? Some of you may remember that name from your biohistory. Lamarck is honored as one who had a kind of early evolutionary theory, kind of pre-Darwin. And he really sort of distinguished himself, Michaux did, studying under these notable botanists. And he really distinguished himself in 1782 when he was sent by the government to the Middle East on a botanical mission. And he really was shining. You know, his star was very much rising to the point where he got the attention of the king. And the king decided, you know, botanical exploration, and let's face it, exploitation, of course, at this time and other times, was largely about not just necessarily discovery for the sake of discovery, but discovery also to find beautiful and useful things. And the monarch, right, Louis XVI, was interested in, you know, finding new and important plants that they could introduce into cultivation in France that could be useful in building and carpentry and medicine and agriculture. And so André Michaux was dispatched to North America to essentially find those interesting, rare, precious, useful plants, as many as he could. He ended up spending a good decade exploring in North America, and this kind of busy-looking map kind of shows you the color coding, indicates the different years where Michaux traveled far and wide, all the way out to St. Louis. He was way up in New York and Pennsylvania. He was really all over the place, but really it might be said that his base was Charleston. Pretty soon after getting established in North America, he decided that he would establish a botanical garden in Charleston that would be a staging area for shipping plants back to France. I want you to notice on this map, and I think maybe I have it on the next, yes, here we go. The next slide here, you can see the dotted line here in the dark sort of blue-purple. These are two of Michaux's expeditions to our part of the country, this very region. And so this is 1787, 1788. Michaux is traveling up the Savannah River all the way to the Blue Ridge. And in fact, this map doesn't quite show his route fully accurately. It is now believed and pretty well established that he traveled through the area that we would now call Sapphire, Cashiers Valley, up to the Highlands Plateau, and then down, and then back around the escarpment to return down to the coast. So kind of coming a little bit further north than this map actually shows. And the latter-day Michaux, in the form of Charlie, has kind of followed in his footsteps. You know, and you see historic markers like this one on Main Street in Highlands, or this one in Charleston, and this one in Johnson City, Tennessee. Following in Michaux's footsteps, honoring his botanical explorations. Because although he was finding interesting and useful plants, he was also finding novel and rare and beautiful plants that in the horticultural trade and simply in botanical science, these have become celebrated and fascinating plants. One example would be flame azalea. Flame azalea apparently was collected, and the name we currently recognize for that species was given by Michaux. The specimens were very likely collected right in the Cashiers area, right in our region. Really pretty neat. One of these 1787 or 88 expeditions yielded many interesting plants. And of course, besides highly historic markers, there are various other ways that people have honored Michaux. So you can take a trip down to the Charleston International Airport, for example, which happens to sit on the site of Michaux's now defunct, of course, botanical garden. Right? Michaux's staging area for shipping things over to Paris. It was actually right there on the site of the runways of the airport. And so this is a nice mural that adorns the airport that was commissioned to honor and celebrate Michaux, kind of show a sort of a reconstruction of what that botanical garden may have looked like, right? So I'm going to really focus on later scholarship. There's been an enormous amount of scholarship looking at Michaux, but it looks like there were several kind of blind alleys and misinterpretations, and some of those caused by Michaux himself. So really one of the definitive, more modern studies comes from Bob Zahner, right? Zahner and Jones, 1983, using Michaux's journals and reconstructing his path, coming up the Savannah River and ultimately into our region. Here's Cashiers, right? Here is Highlands. Gorges is right up here, I suppose, right? So this is June of 1787, and I want to sort of impress upon you that to Michaux, it was quite interesting. What he was approaching as he's coming up from the Piedmont, from the lowlands, is a kind of stair-step topography, the Blue Ridge escarpment. And you can kind of see the escarpment in this map. You get a sense of the escarpment is not a single wall, but this is the crest of the escarpment here. Here's Highlands, and it kind of runs, this is Whiteside Cove, and runs around here. This is Whiteside Mountain, and it kind of continues on and continues on. And so the escarpment is an abrupt change in elevation. And Michaux's destination was come up as high as he could, up onto that escarpment. And to do that, of course, he's traveling well-used trade routes that were used by the indigenous people, by the Cherokee people, and by traders, and following rivers, right, typically. So our story, though, kind of takes us to Paris, where after, in 1787, Michaux collected some specimens of what we now call Oconee-bells. He couldn't quite make sense of it because it was not in flower. And typically, botanists use a flower, floral characters, to identify a species, and often that's really required to even name a species, a flowering plant. No, what he had instead were a couple of leaves and a couple of little fruit capsules, and he didn't quite know what it was. He writes on this note, he found this specimen in the high mountains of Carolina, and then he says, is it a pyrola, which is kind of like a little wintergreen? Is it a pyrola species? Is it a new genus, right? A genus novum? Is it a new genus? He doesn't know what it is. But it's not in flower, and he's moving on to other things. And he kind of puts it away. And it kind of gets lost in that herbarium, and lost, and lost, and lost, until in the next century, the young Asa Gray, right, up-and-coming botanist at Harvard, as all good botanists did in those days, you make a pilgrimage to the great collections and study them, including in Paris. So he finds himself in Paris, where he makes a discovery. And this is Gray writing to his mentor, John Torrey, in 1839. He says, I have something better than all this to tell you. I have discovered a new genus in Michaux's herbarium. It is from that great unknown region, he says, the high mountains of North Carolina. He says we have the fruit, the persistent calyx, but no flowers. But he decides, he knows this is something new and interesting. He's not going to let the fact that he has no flower stop him from naming it. So he goes on, and he has the audacity to say, so we go on here, I claim the right of a discoverer. That's audacity for you, to fix the name. So then he says, this is a good North American genus, comes from near Kentucky. Like, well, wait a minute, we're not that close to Kentucky. It will be christened Shortia, to which we will stand as godfathers. Shortia galasifolia. Right? Shortia galasifolia. And he did this with he had a strategy in mind. This is Charles Short, who was a botanist over in Kentucky. And he decided that if he named this beautiful new species, new genus after Short, that Short would try to find it. Because no one knew where exactly Michaux had found it, other than high mountains of Carolina, right? Quite a mystery, right? So he says, we will lay upon him no greater penalty than the necessary thing. Make a pilgrimage to the mountains of Carolina, right? Find the flowers, right? We must find the flowers, right? So this is I think many of you know this plant, but some of you maybe not, but just so you're kind of familiar with it, both of these species, Shortia and its relative, the common galax, right, that we also love so much, they're both in the Diapensia family, but very, very different flowers, as you can see. But notice that the leaves bear a passing similarity, and so Gray has selected galasifolia for the species name in reference to galax. This is the Shortia with the galax-like leaves, right? That's where the name comes from. And so the mystery was, where did Michaux find this rare and interesting plant? Well, Gray, of course, himself wanted to find this thing. He's quite ambitious, and he was no stranger to the mountains of North Carolina. Right? So he traveled in 1841, he launched an expedition. He spent a huge amount of time searching Roan Mountain, the Roan Highlands, which he loved. That's where Gray's lily, the type locality named in Gray's honor, is found in abundance on Roan Mountain. Right? The Iron Mountains, Grandfather Mountain, the Black Mountains. He thought at the time that the Black Mountains were the highest mountains, perhaps in the U.S. and pretty close. Mount Michaux was the highest in the East, anyway. Failed in this expedition, and he launched another one in 1843, and this also failed. And he's searching all the regions that he knows to be the high mountains of North Carolina. And well, you know, what's going on? Meanwhile, he's getting impatient with Charles Short in Kentucky. And so others, like Curtis, Moses Ashley Curtis, another botanist, writes to Short, and he says, you know, if I had a whole summer to myself in those high mountains, I could bring it to light. I would give no small sum to rediscover it, he says. Short is unmoved, right? John Torrey follows in the same year. He writes a letter and says to Short, I wish you would send a young botanist, right, into the mountains of North Carolina to look for this plant. Like, what's the matter with you? Well, he says, what would I not give to see complete specimens of that plant, right? If I had less to do at home, I would find it if it has not become extinct. Maybe it's gone. And you know, that's not so far-fetched because remember the mystery of Franklinia, right? The Franklin tree, found in great abundance in a very restricted area on the Altamaha River in Georgia by the Bartrams in 1765. And by the end of the century, gone, completely gone, right? So this was a question. Maybe Michaux found it, but maybe now it's disappeared. Maybe it's, you know, chimeric to really try to search for it. Well, another decade goes by, and Charles Short is now deceased by 1863, and he has never, ever so much as contemplated searching for Shortia glacifolia. For whatever reason. So Gray's scheme backfired, and I think many of us in the botanical community would say, man, what a waste of a good genus, right, on somebody who clearly didn't care about this. So Asa Gray, of course, writes a very nice and lengthy memorial to Short, and he notes that 2 or 3 species of Kentucky plants commemorate his name, right, as the discoverer. Also a new genus, Shortia, inhabiting the Allegheny Mountains, right, a name in the 19th century often applied to the whole Appalachian chain, right? Dedicated to him, Gray writes, by the present writer. Alas, it is too like the botanist for whom it was named, right? This species is so retiring in its habits, it is not known as it ought to be. It lies as yet unseen, except by that single botanist of a former time, right? Former century. Some secluded recesses of the Black Mountains of North Carolina. So he's really lamenting. This is 1863 now, and he concludes his memorial by saying, it will someday be found again and appreciated. Well, indeed, but it takes time, right? It takes time. And in the meantime, Gray is becoming increasingly intrigued by this plant because Gray realizes in the 1860s that Shortia is actually closely related to certain plants found in Asia. And in particular, he first realizes this with this beautiful little thing, Schizocodon, closely related. You see the family resemblance, right? And this is actually part of a very big pattern that Gray discovered and is honored for today. This, by the way, is another one. This is the fringed galax, Schizocodon solitarides, right? The fringed galax. There's another very beautiful one. This is a Shortia uniflora, found in Japan, right? Originally, this was put in Schizocodon. It was reallocated to reassigned to Shortia. Beautiful, very pink-looking, but you see it looks very much like our Shortia glacifolia. Well, Gray realized that this plant shows a striking relationship that many of our plants show. It turns out Gray would have been delighted to know that that relationship with Shortia, there are actually many more members of this genus now known to occur in Asia. And a lot of this is efforts that are owed to Chip Gaddy, who lives in Clemson. Here he is, photographed in China. Chip Gaddy, a fellow plant enthusiast, right? Plant nerd, he would say. Keenly interested in finding relatives of this plant. So this is a paper from 2017. This is Shortia sinensis. This is rotata. You see a much longer corolla tube here, right? So we're having more and more Shortia species coming to light. And then, just this year, 2024, Gaddy and a colleague in Japan published a paper, Endangered Species Biology, naming 3 new Shortia species. Very exciting. So the ones that are new are indicated here, right, with asterisks, like Oconee right here. Resurrecting some names that have been known in the literature but were not thought to be good species. They've now recognized those as good species. So these are a couple of the herbarium specimens. Look at how deeply toothed this one is. Right? Really interesting, these leaves. But you very much see the family resemblance, right? So the species is kind of proliferating. There's now about 10 Shortia species represented. And this goes hand in hand with a pattern that Gray had discovered in the 1850s. He's fascinated by this very curious connection between Eastern North America and Eastern Asia. And he made the discovery while he was doing an analysis, he says, at the request of an esteemed correspondent. That correspondent was Charles Darwin, actually. And he, as part of this analysis, Darwin had asked him to look at the similarities of American plants with Asian plants and think about ways to sort of quantify this. And Gray came up with a really interesting way to illustrate this. You see this list of plant families. Notice that on the left, we have a bunch of plant families found here in Eastern North America. In the middle, we have the subset that are also found in Western North America. But then we have, on the far right, oops, sorry, did not mean to do that. We go back here we go. Notice on the far right, these are the same families that are also found in Eastern Asia. So in one glance, you see the amazing correspondence between the flora of our region and that of East Asia, parts of China, Japan, Korea, etc. Biogeographers, plant ecologists, we now call this the great Arcto-Tertiary flora, a long period of geological history when a very similar flora, forest types and the plants that make up these forests, from the herbs to the trees, found all the way around the northern hemisphere, Europe, Eurasia, North America, etc. So Gray made that discovery, and he realized that Shortia very much fits this pattern, right? But he's still kind of frustrated. No one has still found Shortia galasifolia in the type locality. And then he gets very excited word in 1877. He doesn't hear about it right away, but a discovery is made. And a teenager, right, whose father is an herbalist, and so out collecting plants and people that know their plants, actually found what turned out to be Shortia galasifolia, right, but growing near the Catawba River. Gray did not receive a specimen for another year, and he was, of course, overjoyed. But on the other hand, this is not where Michaux found it, right? What's going on, right? Well, he had to see it in the flesh, as it were. So in 1879, Gray traveled once again to North Carolina. He went to McDowell County, and he saw living Shortia at last. But he was very concerned because there was so much excitement over the discovery that plant lovers, plant enthusiasts, and horticulturists immediately started digging it up. And so relatively little was left when he actually got there. He was very concerned about that at the time. But he knew this can't be right? Watersheds apart, if you think about it. Highlands, and so this is now from the herbarium of Harvard University, the Gray Herbarium, named in his honor, right? And of course, Gray wasted no time announcing the discovery. So he wrote up an article for the Botanical Gazette, right, from 1879, and I'm just going to show you a little snippet of it. You see at the very bottom of this page, Shortia galasifolia rediscovered. 100 years ago, the elder Michaux collected somewhere in the mountains of North Carolina a specimen of a pyralaceous-looking plant. And he kind of went on to say, you know, finally this has been rediscovered, but this is not where Michaux found it, right? So the mystery endured. By the way, through the efforts of Gaddy and others, recently, let's see, this is 2019, the subspecies in McDowell County, Brevistyla, has been elevated to species status. So now we can say that there are 2 Shortia species here in the southeast. We have Galasifolia and we have Brevistyla. Here they are. Right? Both of them very narrow endemics. Right? Their geographical range is very, very restricted. Right? And Brevistyla comes from the shortened pistil. You see this here? Very short compared to this one. Right? That's where Brevistyla comes from. I actually think there's a good deal of variation. There might be a little bit of overlap, though. You know, that's maybe equivalent. So the new hunt begins. Find the type locality. And so entering the story here is a student who is an undergraduate studied with Gray, Charles Sprague Sargent, right, who became really a leading dendrologist and the founding director of the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard University. And he decided to try to retrace Michaux' steps, and he chose Highlands as his point of departure, interestingly enough. So what he did with, and I'm going to say something about who he traveled with. So here's Highlands, and here you see the escarpment area. Here is Sapphire. So first traveled to Sapphire, and then headed south for the escarpment, basically heading from the Whitewater River and environs, and really extending the collecting way down. And not just looking for Shortia, but also some rare magnolias that Michaux had found. And they came to find populations of Shortia galasifolia in an area that they knew as Bear Camp. And we still sort of see that name in the form of Bear Camp Creek. So here is Bear Camp Creek. I think this is the Horse Pasture River, is that right? Yeah, right here. Bear Camp Creek that also kind of feeds into Lake Jocassee, right? It is in this area somewhere, right, that Sargent had, and his guides had rediscovered Shortia galasifolia. And he is over the moon, right? He immediately writes to Asa Gray, right? He writes to Gray in Boston, and Gray kind of wires back, "My dear Sargent, would I were with you. I can only say, crown yourself with glory by discovering the habitat, the original habitat of Shortia, which we will believe Michaux found near where Magnolia cordata came from in the first expedition." Right. So Gray is super excited. Gray is quite elderly at this point. He has ill health. He's not in any condition to travel, so he can't come down and see the type locality, sadly. I mentioned that Sargent didn't go alone, right? He had guides, and his guides came from Highlands. Those of you that may have visited the Highlands Historical Society may recognize this, the Prince House, also called the Wright Prince House. This is one of the oldest houses extant in Highlands, built in 1877. This was the home of Frank Boynton, which, with his brother Charlie, was one of 2 of the major guides that led Charles Sprague Sargent to find Oconee bells. So there's still aspects of this story that are a bit of a mystery. Part of the mystery comes from the puzzle of the year that Michaux had entered in his journal. He said that he found Oconee bells in December of 1788. That cannot be true. because of finding the fruit capsule. And so Zahner and Jones kind of recognized that this cannot be correct. And clearly what Michaux had done is, in writing up his notes and rewriting them, he conflated his two expeditions, 1787 and 1788. And so if you follow his instructions on his travels from the 1787 expedition, it was in June of that expedition that he would have passed right through the heartland of OconeeBells. Right? That's the thinking now. So Zahner and Jones conclude, based on recent interpretations, they can even pinpoint right about the date, because OconeeBells has such a narrow natural range that you can kind of reckon as Michaux is traveling by horse, right, when he enters the range and when he exits the range. So they can actually pinpoint just about June 13th, right, 1787, he must have found this. Of course, we know that OconeeBells is an early bloomer, March, right, maybe a little bit into April, but by June, no flowers, you have a fruiting capsule, right? By December, the capsules are gone, right? You don't even have the fruiting capsule anymore. So I wanted to show you, here you see, I just overlaid here, under Lake Jocassee, right, the route that Michaux would have taken as he came up this, what would have been the Whitewater River, the Kiwi River, as he knew it. Now, there's another Highlands connection. I mentioned Charlie and Frank Boynton. What I didn't mention, but I'll mention now, is that in addition to the Boynton brothers, right, there were twin teenage boys on this expedition, right? Harlan and Harry Kelsey. These were the children of one of the co-founders of Highlands. And in fact, the family was, I mean, their livelihood was made in the horticultural trade, right? So they established in Highlands the Highlands Nursery. And this is an early advertisement. This is from 1887. Highlands Nursery, ornamental trees and shrubbery native to western North Carolina. This concern is responsible for introducing a huge array of beautiful native southern Appalachian plants into the trade. Right? They become known as a result of the Kelsey family's efforts. And so what we see from very early on is that, of course, they recognize a rarity like OconeeBells, people are going to want this plant. And so these are some of their catalogs, right? Hardy American plants. This is 1895 and 6, a little bit later, 1902, 1925. Notice by 1925 here, or even here, notice Boston, Salem, Massachusetts. So the family expanded their nursery from Highlands to Linville Gorge area near Grandfather Mountain. From there, they expanded it up to Boston and Salem. And that's where it really thrived. It was up in Salem, Massachusetts. And here's kind of a close look at, this is how they advertise OconeeBells. The beautiful and rare shortia, notice the language here, introduced by us. Right? They introduced it. A fine stock of strong established plants. How much? $5 per 100. What? Amazing. $5 for 100, $35 for 1,000. Right? Heavier clumps, $10 per 100. You know, that's what they were going for, right? So from the 1880s, because of the recognition that this is such a beautiful and interesting and rare plant, and there was this kind of fascinating history behind it that nobody could find it, right? I think that it was coveted, right? And so you actually find this plant not just growing in abundance at the Highlands Biological Station, but really you find it growing in abundance all around Highlands and Cashews. I think that from early on, people really wanted to have this interesting plant. The site of the nursery, the Kelsey Nursery in Massachusetts, is actually now preserved. And so here it is called the Kelsey Arboretum, right, established in 1929. And this is only, I think it's like 6 acres or so. 4 acres, ornamental trees and shrubs planted by Harlan Kelsey, early 20th century landscape architects. So the Kelseys ultimately were able to provide a lot of these plants to to Olmsted, right? So the Vanderbilt estate had quite a lot of Kelsey plants, and through their connections with landscape architects and garden designers of prominence, these southern Appalachian beautiful plants, flowering shrubs, azaleas of various kinds, all kinds of beautiful herbaceous plants, including OconeeBells, made it into the trade. Also endemics like Carolina hemlock, right, that you simply can only find in our region. A biography was published a few years ago that I can recommend, Beautiful Land of the Sky, right? Harlan Kelsey, his efforts at conservation, he was also on the National Park Commission back in the 20s and 30s. And this region actually came rather close to being, was in consideration for national park designation. We kind of lost out to the Smokies, but you could understand, Smokies is pretty cool, but they were actively looking all along the escarpment region as a possible kind of national park grade region, right? So I want to just conclude here by sort of revisiting some comments that were made by Frank Boynton back in 1889, right? He wrote an article for Garden and Forest called The Home of Shorty, and he recounted the story, right, and his role in the rediscovery. And I think the reason why I want to show you this passage, he's kind of describing, now this is a couple of years later, and they're traveling back down again, Whitewater Falls, and they're going down to the Jocassee Valley, and they're really interested in exactly how high will Shorty grow. And it is remarkable, right, that really it is highly restricted, right? You sort of take one step out of, 3 feet too high, and suddenly you're within the range. Why does it stay in that particular area? It's kind of an interesting mystery. And so they comment on this, and I want you to notice that he says, even though they're so very limited in their range, he says, what is comforting to the botanist is that it can't be exterminated. He says, the land is too steep to be cultivated, there's such an abundance, no amount of collecting, he says, can ever effect it strenuously, right, in his words. And I thought that was a bit poignant to kind of think about, right, because what he couldn't imagine is that entire valley would be practically obliterated, right? So kind of think about this extremely narrow endemic. This again is from the Bonner Jones paper showing the path of Michaux, and in the stippling all along the little tiny creeks, little tributaries of the rivers, OconeeBells grows in great abundance, and in its natural environment, it really hugs the creeks, right? It loves those creeks. And what they couldn't imagine was that if you kind of look at that route taken by Michaux, right, to superimpose Lake Jocassee on it, right? The lake has destroyed, the vast majority of the natural populations of this species, right? So that's pretty sad. And here's Devil's Fork State Park, and here on Devil's Fork, there are of course still there are tributaries with OconeeBells in some abundance, but you can imagine that the numbers in its natural environment are a small fraction, right, of what they once were before the lake. But in anticipation of this lake, in addition to this plant having been collected since the 1880s, I think in recognition that this habitat would be destroyed by the lake, a great many plant lovers for years went down and rescued as many plants as they could. And this is also why we have such an abundance of OconeeBells and other plants that were rescued from the Jocassee Valley around that time. This lake was completed, I believe it was 1973. So that's kind of the story of this fascinating plant, and really how it came to be so locally abundant in Highlands, why we celebrate it, partly for its own beauty and partly for the intriguing story, behind it. And there's just a little postscript to mention about a little sad for Gray. He couldn't get down here in the late 1880s. Gray died in 1888, Great. So just a couple of years after it was rediscovered in the Jocassee Valley. And I'm glad to say that in very recent years, there's been an effort to kind of renew Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Asa Gray is buried, along with a variety of other notable Harvard biologists and other scientists. And in so doing, kind of honors some of his scientific discoveries. The new Asa Gray garden, for example, features Eastern North American plants with their Eastern Asian sister species planted side by side, which is very cool thing. And I'm happy to say that there is an extensive propagation effort ongoing. Right? These are OconeeBells being propagated at Mount Auburn Cemetery. These plants will they will adorn the grave, right, of Asa Gray. So, I like to think, lost no more. This neat plant will be associated with Gray, right? It will be growing, and it was derived. I mean, who knows where yours came from? Could have been a more recent propagation or seed.
Robert E.'s yard.
Or maybe descended from one of these earlier population rescue. I'm not sure. I'm not even sure where all the ones at the biological station came from. And I have ideas that we can do an interesting genetic analysis. It'd be pretty cool.
Jim, just a postulate. So the ice ages pushed many species from Canada north down into the Highlands area. I'm curious as to maybe how you could surmise why just in the Jocassee Valley would this little plant thrive there. I mean, is it sheltered from ice? The ice cap didn't cover it, or any of that known? Or?
I don't have a good answer for that, really. It is kind of an ecological mystery. I mean, it may in fact be sort of relictual, as so many plants are, with a broader distribution at one time.
You push down that little bitty pocket
and it persists and it thrives in that very small area, seemingly very healthy populations, but it doesn't spread from there. And it's curious that when it's transplanted, like here or in Highlands, it does fine. So yeah, I just don't have a good answer for.
Can you propagate from seeds, or?
They can be propagated from seed, yeah. And I know that Jeff Sommer has been successful in doing that. And, probably most of the propagation is vegetative, I'm guessing.
Right.
But they can be propagated from seed. Yeah.
And then in the Jocassee Valley, how shaded would it have been? I mean, how much sun did these plants get? Do you say in a day, maybe an hour a day, or direct sunlight, or none maybe?
Well, I would say more. I mean, this is just based on what we see now.
Yeah.
So when you kind of follow the creeks, when they're blooming in March, before the trees have really
they have plenty of sunlight.
Plenty of sunlight.
So it's an ephemeral light.
They'll grow in the shade under rhododendron.
Yeah.
Under some mountain laurel. Yeah, they seem to be fairly hardy where they are in a variety of conditions, but close to the stream, maybe getting about 10 feet upslope from the creeks there.
Very acidic soil, right? Soil. And not many things grow under rhododendron, is what I'm saying.
It probably is acidic and kind of sandy. It's oaky and those pines.
Yeah.
Elevation doesn't seem to make any difference.
There probably is some limit, I'm guessing, but clearly, like, we have it growing at 4,200 feet at our house, and that does okay. So I wonder, like, how high can you go with it? But again, that's in terms of sort of planting them ourselves and maybe taking care of them. But the natural population, this does not seem to budge from where it is. Curiously. Yeah.
How does it naturally seed out? I mean, is it wind? Does it just drop?
The seeds are how does it seed out? Very tiny seeds. And you would think, one would think that in light of the fact that it's growing along the streams, that water is perhaps playing a role. To my knowledge, and my botany friends with more botanical acumen than I have might tell me that, confirmed for me that I don't believe that those tiny seeds have those little juicy tidbits called eliosomes that ants often use to disperse wildflower seeds. That's true. Is that true? Yeah. So just a little tiny thing like the size of a sesame seed, or smaller. Yes.
What insects are associated with as pollinating the shortia?
Generalists.
They are generalists,
They are
not
generalists.
specialists.
They are generalists, and they seem to be, at that time of year, this is when I'm seeing them down in Devil's Fork. Bees, especially the earlier emerging bumblebee and carpenter bee queens will visit them, but I've seen small flies, and there were a number. There's not a whole lot, but on a nice warm sunny day in March at that elevation, there's actually a fair amount of insect activity. But you don't get a lot of the bee activity, like a lot of bee activity, till later. These would be the very earliest bees that are emerging.
One little point, they are super hardy plants.
Super hard, yeah.
I mean, you hardly need to take any care in planting or to take care in maintaining them.
Yeah.
They just survive unless the deer do.
And any of you tried to grow them at even way higher elevation?
Well, no, I'm growing them at my house. Well, and yeah, I have some here in Cashers
Yeah.
and Stillmont that succeeded everywhere. And occasionally I gift them to someone that's doing a terrarium. They do exceptional in a terrarium.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, they are remarkably hardy, So I think that they'll be fine growing especially now with climate change perhaps, but in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I think that on basic raised grade, you're going to do perfect.
I'm saying they'd have a harder time in Florida. I'd be more worried about going south than going north.
Too long, yeah. All right, any questions? Other questions, anybody?
Are they for sale in Highlands?
They are for sale. You don't often see them at nurseries. Chautauqua Gardens in Cashers, Jeff and Jody's honor have grown them. They probably still have them. Someone else may know.
They do have them. They're one of the only nurseries that is permitted to
Licensed
sell
to
them.
propagate them. Yeah.
So everything I have has been gifted to me. I just re-gift it to someone else.
Yeah.
When the project might be related to another plant,
Indeed.
which you might know.
There's no shortage of cool plants. Absolutely.
Well, they work real good with mosses.
Yes, your favorite. I'm sorry, one more.
So, in its natural state, it's always growing near a stream. But in Highlands, does that matter, or is it?
That made a big difference for
It
me.
doesn't seem to matter.
But we get enough rain.
But this gets so much rain here, so.
It's wet
The
enough,
road fine
maybe
and
that-
uplands away from water, and we do have some planted along streams at the Wildflower station, and they do fine, but they don't seem like they do any better than others that are planted elsewhere. So,
Soil type important?
is what's our
Soil type important, acidic or?
Yeah, it's acidic here.
For sure, yeah.
And down there, I'm going to guess it's on the acidic side as well. So, yeah. So it's a great plant for the chapter to have adopted as its.
Yeah.
its- Wait a